let's start with looking at the things that might go wrong. So what sort of issues do we need to consider when things go wrong? And I'm going to throw that to Alex first, because he's all ready for me.
Sure, thanks, Kat. So I think before we start with sort of formal processes and considerations when things do go wrong, I think it's quite important to say that a lot of the issues that happen in early stage companies are normally to do with personalities, and that could be personalities with suppliers, it could be personalities with customers, or it could be simply a personality clash between founders. What we experience is that those sort of situations, particularly in an early stage company where you are spending every single hour with either a co-founder or with employees, means that to a certain extent there is a very narrow perspective on what needs to be done or how it needs to be done, which obviously leads to the ultimate success of the business generally. But from an employment perspective, what it can mean is that issues potentially become bigger or become out of hand quicker than they potentially need to. So one thing that Jeff and I have always talked about when we have these conversations, and I'm sure Nicola will agree as well, is that it's always worth having a conversation. So if you have an investor, having a light touch discussion with that investor director, finding essentially a neutral party that could potentially mediate if there are issues between you and a co-founder, and also sitting down with that individual to really formalize what the issues are and giving some room for improvement. Making snap decisions ultimately is where things can spiral very quickly. So I think the sort of key important lessons there are always try and keep chains of communication open as far as you possibly can. Always try to consider bringing in a third party as a sort of mediator, or someone with a different perspective, or indeed someone who's gone through a similar situation in the past, bearing in mind confidentiality to the company. And then probably thirdly, when things do go wrong, go and get some proper advice about it. So in session 1, we sort of talked about the importance of always having documentation in place. And it's really important to have that documentation in place to reflect the reality of the situation at the beginning of a relationship. But actually that document becomes ever more important if things were to go wrong. So that includes, for example, setting out what potentially might be considered to be a gross misconduct offence, what notice period someone is subject to, how long they've been with the company for, what do they do in reality, what their duties are, all of those types of considerations, and particularly with founders as well, their obligations in respect of fiduciary duties, both express and implied. So what to do if things have gone past the stage where mediation hasn't worked, sensible discussions haven't worked, you're in a position where a co-founder is either not performing or is conducting themselves in such a way that it is simply not possible for you to continue to work with them, or indeed that they are putting the company potentially into disrepute, and meaning that you potentially can't seek future investment with them there at the current time. Then you need to have a look from an employment perspective, first of all, of what their employment contract says. So how long have they been with you? You might remember we touched on this ever so slightly in previous sessions, that if someone has got less than 2 years service with a company, then they don't have what's known as ordinary unfair dismissal rights, which means that essentially there is not so much of an obligation to follow particular processes. So putting that in reverse, if someone has more than 2 years service, in order to dismiss them, you have to dismiss them for a fair reason and follow a reasonable process in doing so. So that could be redundancy, for example, it could be performance, it could be conduct. But in all situations, you'd need to follow a fair and reasonable process. Where someone has got less than 2 years service, there's still an obligation on you to make sure that you are following a degree of process, mainly to cover off any risks of, or mitigate the risks of, a potential discrimination claim. So someone just simply saying you followed this process because I had this protected characteristic, or a whistleblowing claim. And whistleblowing in the simplest possible form is you work in a supermarket, you spot your boss with their hand in the till, you say, I'm going to report you to head office, and the boss sacks you. So you still need to be aware of those concerns, because if someone has got a protected characteristic, so any type of discrimination or a whistleblowing element, then they can bring an unfair dismissal claim, even if they haven't got qualifying service. In fact, they can bring that from day one of their employment. But it is a consideration of how long they've been with you for. Secondly, what's their notice period? What's the conditions of that notice period? Do you have the right to pay them in lieu? Do they have the right to be placed on garden leave? All of those are valid considerations in the circumstances. And then really what you need to be considering is, do you have any particular processes? Do you have any contractual policies or handbooks? Generally speaking, we advise that you wouldn't have a contractual policy to allow for flexibility, but you might, if you've put in place a contractual policy from an online resource or from documentation that you found from previous employment. That does happen. We have seen that before. So you need to be quite careful to manage, for example, grievance procedures or disciplinary procedures. You also need to think about essentially what is the outcome that you are looking for here, and what is potentially the quickest way of getting to that point. Now, in most of these situations, more often than not, that ends up in what's known as an open process and a without prejudice, otherwise known as off the record process. So essentially you are presenting, let's just say there was a conduct issue here, you'd essentially be writing to the individual, inviting them to a meeting to discuss the conduct and warning them that, subject to an investigation, there may be severe issues that may be considered. On a WP basis, you might be writing to them saying, we are following through with this investigation and our concerns are X, Y, and Z. But as an alternative, we would be willing to reach some sort of compromise with you where you don't have to, that process doesn't complete. So that brings that process to an end, particularly with performance, you see that, which could be a long drawn out process. So for performance, it's typically a 6-month process with two warnings, one probably sort of 2 months, one at 4 months, and then potentially dismissal at 6 months. But there's always the sort of up and down with performance. So essentially you'd be saying to the individual, rather than putting you through a performance process, which could really affect everyone involved, as an alternative to that, we would be prepared to pay you an additional sum of money as an ex gratia payment. And in return for that, we would expect you to waive particular rights or claims or rights of action against the company arising from your employment or its termination. Now, that's sort of the sort of overall process that you might run. As part of that, as you can imagine, those discussions become quite complicated. They can become protracted. And one of the areas that they become particularly protracted around is essentially this person might have 3 hats on. So they're an employee, which obviously we've talked about, but they're also probably likely to be a director. And how do you remove them as a director, or considerations around that, and also as a shareholder? And that's probably quite a neat point to hand over to Nicola, just to talk through those 2 considerations.
If you are looking to part company, shall we say, with somebody who is involved with the business, what you do need to think about is the different hats that they wear. And so some people will wear the employee hat, and the only relationship that they have with the company is as an employee. Some people, however, might also wear the shareholder hat. And this is particularly pertinent in relation to founders who will have shares right from the outset of the company. You might also find in some situations that those founders might hold 2 different classes of shares. So they might have the shares that they were awarded as part of the formation of the company, so sort of connected to their performance and their role. But some founders also choose to invest into the company as well. So sometimes what we see is a demarcation between the treatment of the shares that they receive by way of their investment versus the treatment of shares which they get by way of their role within the company. And then you have options as well. And, what happens if they've exercised options? Well, does that, is that an investment on their part? And so what you do with all of this is you actually just go to a lawyer who, and if it's us, we sit down with lots of bits of paper. So we will sit down with an employment contract or a service agreement in the case of a director and say, right, well, under this, here are the various things that we need to consider to wrap up when we no longer want you to be part of our day-to-day lives anymore. We'll then sit down with the shareholders agreement and the articles of association and say, right, okay, you are a shareholder in this company. What do the provisions in the articles of association and the shareholders agreement say happen to your shares in the event that you leave the company? So in the articles of association, there are usually some fairly detailed provisions around what we call leaver provisions, which look at why somebody is leaving the company. Are they leaving for a good reason? Are they leaving for a bad reason? What happens to their shares, proportion of shares, and the mechanics around that. And then we'll also sit down with their option agreement as well and say, okay, what do we need to do in relation to the option agreement and your option shares? And how does that also fill in and work alongside, for example, the articles of association? So there are all these things that need to be sort of taken into account. It's also these things where actually potential issues can be flagged up with legal documents by way of example. So Alex and I have certainly been involved in situations where founders have entered into agreements with each other, and they've all entered an agreement that says, yeah, we all agree that we're going to be fully dedicated to this business, and in the event that one of us leaves, over this sliding scale of time, we're going to give up our shares, or we're going to give up an entitlement to shares. And then they come to enforce that because actually they do fall out with each other, or somebody decides they want to go and work for Google or whatever it might be, and they present us with this document. And it's like, yeah, that's kind of great. What do your articles of association say? And then you realize that the articles of association ignore this agreement. And so what you can be faced with, particularly with some founders agreements, is an agreement between founders that in the event that somebody leaves, they're going to give up or cease to be entitled to a proportion of their shares. However, the second part of that is the mechanics relating to that need to be included in the articles of association. And if they're not, what you're going to end up with is a shareholder with some shares that says, yes, I appreciate I need to give up some of these shares because that's what I agreed. However, our documentation doesn't tell us when I need to give up those shares or how I need to give up those shares. So I will give them up. I'm just going to keep hold of them for the time being, and maybe I'll give them up at exit, which isn't necessarily kind of the outcome that perhaps people were intending when they entered into those agreements in the first place. So this is why it is really important when you're dealing with, sort of anybody who might have a role both as a shareholder and as an employee and potentially as an option holder, to ensure that there is an alignment across all of those documents to make sure they actually work. Otherwise, you end up in all sorts of pickles with regard to, well, yes, we can dismiss him under an employment or her under an employment agreement using this mechanism, but actually they're still entitled to keep their shares. And the last thing that you want is a really grumpy, disgruntled, sort of former founder who feels very aggrieved about life, still holding shares in your company. You also don't want them holding shares in your company with voting rights and information rights in the event that they go and work for a competitor, by way of example. And I think the other thing, kind of when looking at the different roles that people have and considering, kind of what happens when you dismiss them, are things like non-competes and restrictive covenants. And so people often question why we have covenants or non-compete provisions both under the shareholders agreement and under employment contracts. There are really good reasons. The first is that under an employment contract, those provisions are governed by employment law, and they are therefore enforceable directly by the company, who's the counterparty to that agreement, through an employment law process. Covenants which are in a shareholders agreement are governed by contract law and are a matter of bargain. And covenants under a shareholders agreement are often enforced not just by the company, but actually also by investors or other parties who have a direct course of action to be able to enforce those. So again, looking at in the event that you're looking at ostensibly parting company with somebody, there are all these things that you need to think about: employment hats, shareholder hats, option holder hats, and all of those provisions that thread through all of that documentation in order to kind of ensure that when that person exits from the company, you've done so in accordance with process, so you avoid any, sort of further, sort of claims, but also they're fully aware of what the expectation is going forward, for example, in respect of non-compete arrangements.
So it all gets very muddy and very messy very quickly if you haven't got your paperwork right at the outset.
Let alone throw a bit of emotion in.
Oh, yes, of course, there's always emotion in this process, isn't there?
Mm.
And of course, there's always money and tax implications, which is a neat segue to say, Sharon.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, a question I frequently get is, X is leaving my company, he's got shares, he's got employment, etc. How should I structure it that he pays less? He or she, I shouldn't be sexist, pays less tax, which is, of course, a very, very valid question. But the obvious answer to that, to a certain extent, is that yes, there might be a little bit tweaking around the edges that might influence in a small way what people are paid, but actually you've got to be really careful on these things, because clearly as a company you don't want to be seen to be doing something that doesn't really reflect the commercial reality of what is actually happening just for an employee's tax purpose. And that is always my number one bit of advice if I ever get asked that question. That being said, it's helpful just to understand what the different tax implications are of the various things that we have talked about so far on the call. First of all, we just take a pure employee, and how are they taxed on any payments you might make to them when they're leaving the company. This is actually quite a complex area, and there's an awful lot of case law that surrounds it, and it's far too complicated to go into all that just on the call today. But if there's one sort of piece of information that you should take, it's that if any of those payments that you make to people are contractual in any way at all, so under their employment contract, either amounts that are due to them or any amounts, for instance, in lieu of notice, etc., the chances are that those will be taxable in the usual way. Will have to go through the payroll, through PAYE, and NI will generally apply. People often think, and I've heard of the fact that there is a tax exempt amount that can be paid to employees, currently £30,000, where you don't have to pay tax, but that is only actually applicable in very limited circumstances where actually, there is no contractual right to that amount. So that's something in the first instance that, needs to be factored in really, and for you to get some advice on. Standing back then, if we are then looking at someone who is also a shareholder, this is where it can get quite complicated. If generally you sell shares in that you own, be it in the company you work for or in the stock exchange or wherever, then you pay capital gains tax, not income tax, and generally those rates are lower than income tax. So there might be a temptation, I guess, to think, oh, if we pay more for someone's shares and pay them less under their employment contract, they'll pay less tax. Unfortunately, that's been thought at by the tax authorities, and that it's not very easy to do that at all. But as rightly so, because if you sell your shares back to the company that you work for, or some other major shareholder in that company, for instance, buys those shares, and you are paid more than what is the market value for those shares, then there's a lot of case law and tax legislation that says the amount that you pay in excess of market value is actually subject to income tax and national insurance and not to capital gains tax. So, always worth sort of bearing that in mind. So that, I think, are the main messages on the actual departing individual. There are a few other traps you've got to be really careful of that are reasonably common in spin-out situations. It may be that in funding the the spin out situation, for example, you have got investment under either the EIS scheme or the CDIS scheme, or you may have VCTs invested in your company. You've got to be very careful that any of the transactions that you undertake with, say, a major founder don't somehow scupper that investment, that the relief that those investors have already claimed, the tax relief that they have claimed for the investments they've made. To give you an example of that, if you have a company that has had an EIS investment in the last 3 years, the founder leaves, you want to pay that founder some money, you then say, well, the company will buy back your shares if legally you can do that, and you can't always, but let's just assume for a moment you can. Your shares will get cancelled, we will pay you some money. That could upset the tax relief of the EIS investors. And whether those are individual angels or an EIS fund, that doesn't go down very well. So there's a few traps and things that, you know, the company also has to watch out for on these things. And then just finally, you know, even after you've taken the advice, there's also quite a lot of paperwork that you might have to do and go through. So, you know, Nicola mentioned options, for instance. If someone leaves and their options lapsed, you will need to let HMRC know about that on your annual return. So, and I appreciate that's a quick canter through, but I guess the overall thing is that there are implications. There are also of all these things, both direct and associated, and therefore, you know, really good idea to get advice before you actually put pen to paper and do anything.
A large number of bear traps available to catch you. So it seems to me as though the best thing to do is to try and avoid everything going wrong in the first place. And Alex, I know that you lovely people at Taylor Vinters have a wonderful booklet or a set of ideas. So do you want to just canter through those 10 common HR pitfalls to be avoided?
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, I think just before I get to that, I mean, I think the sort of takeaway point to all of this is that it can become a very involved and costly process if you are looking at exiting someone. But it's always important to get the advice properly first before committing. That's really one of the major traps that I've seen in these situations, that founders will discuss between themselves of, yes, you can go, but on these terms. And then you'll find out actually that there's no ability, for example, for such options to vest in the way that they've said that they will do, or that there are tax consequences arising from what's been discussed, or indeed that we'll pay you these sums and they will be paid tax-free. Ultimately, they might not be. And then essentially those negotiations start again. But with the company being on the back foot, that it has already made representations or promises about what that deal might look like. So that's one of the key things to mention. And then in terms of prevention, really the number one priority there is making sure that you have all of your documents in line, that you've had the opportunity to take advice when you start. If you start on the right foot and have everything documented accordingly, and then you've taken the proper advice, you're going to be a much better footing if things do go wrong. But actually, you're going to be in a much better footing generally in terms of future investment. It means that when you've got future DD rounds, there's going to be less concerns that are raised. It's potentially going to make you more attractive generally if you have a reputation in the market for being on top of things. So all of those considerations are really important. And then separately, and Kat, I don't know if you want to share this, but we have put together an article which is available on our website about the top 10 tips for founders. And it reflects sort of our experience of certain considerations. Really what we're talking about there, main considerations at the very beginning. So, and how generally issues could go wrong. So not necessarily linked to founders directly in terms of if there was a founder fallout, more just in terms of general employment practices. So those include, for example, inconsistent hiring, So again, making sure that you have carefully thought through the skills that are required for a particular role, that you've carried out a fair recruitment process, you've not just relied on social media as an example of those considerations. Incorrect employment structures, now we talked about that again in the last couple of sessions, and making sure that you're identifying if someone is truly an employee, a worker, or that they're self-employed. You're not classifying them as something else at their request. That it does reflect the realities of the situation. Then we move on to unprotected company interests. And again, the importance of making sure that you have clear documentation, mainly around post-termination restricted governance that Nicola touched on earlier, but also around really key considerations such as confidentiality and IP. And you might remember we talked about the fact that the position in law, if you're an employee, is that IP generated would ordinarily belong to the employer, but we'd have some more robust provisions around that, including some power of attorney wording. But probably more important than that is where you've got consultants, making sure that there is a valid assignment of those intellectual property rights, because the position at law is that the consultant would own those rights unless they are otherwise assigned. Then again, it's about making sure that the documentation you've got is fit for your business. You haven't just gone and taken off-the-shelf policies or procedures that might put you into trouble later. So you might remember at the beginning of this, I said that I've seen circumstances where companies have, for some reason or another, adopted a policy from a previous business. That's a contractual grievance or disciplinary procedure which has 15 steps in it that they potentially don't necessarily need to follow and may not be applicable to the business. So that's really important. Making sure that there's an awareness of employee rights, hopefully by being on the last 3 sessions, we've done a little job of building up that sort of knowledge. But equally, there are quite a lot of free resources out there. The ACAS website is a really good introduction if you want to take some time to do some bedtime reading. There's a good opportunity there to essentially look at key processes and key considerations. Then really we're talking about management of workplace conflict that we've talked about, and tackling that at the very beginning, not letting it drag on or escalate. And again, that might mean bringing someone else in to assist or guide in those types of situations. A failure to gather evidence is a really key one, and one we see all the time of, that's happened, but I haven't really got the time to deal with it at the moment. Let's just brush that under the carpet and hope it doesn't come back. It's probably going to come back, and you're going to be in a worse footing if you haven't documented why you took a particular decision at a certain stage. And then we're really looking at poor management of sickness and absence. And again, that can apply to all levels of employees. So making sure that you're sort of on it if someone is off, making sure that there's particular processes for them to follow, for them to notify. And if someone is genuinely off with a particular issue and you've got doctor's notes to do that, what do you need to do to support them, potentially make reasonable adjustments, go and look for a medical report, and to be informed about what you might need to do in those circumstances. And then again, we talk about lack of employee engagement. And this is something that Jeff and I talked about quite a lot in session 1 of at the very beginning, in terms of how do you separate your business and bring that talent in, but also how do you make sure that you don't just have that as a sort of poster for what your organization is, but you make sure that you have that on a day-to-day basis, and you consider always developing and changing your company. And an early stage company has the best opportunity to do that, because hopefully at the point it reaches the next round of funding or the next series of funding, it then has the ability to use that, a proportion of the proceeds of sale, to change the business, to expand, to be more dynamic, and potentially to change focus in certain areas. So there's really quite a lot of excitement associated with that element. But those are sort of the main tips of hoping that things don't go wrong, and putting practices in place from the very beginning to protect you if they do go wrong. And I think that's really the sort of overarching theme of this today, is that things unfortunately may go wrong. People might decide to leave. That's human nature. But what can you do to make sure that you best protect your business, and what do you need to do in those circumstances if someone does go?
So that's an awful lot of quite complex input. So probably a good point to see if people have got questions, or if indeed they're still alive. Sorry, I wasn't casting any aspersions on your wonderful input, any of the three of you, but it is quite a challenging topic, isn't it?
When it comes down to people, and it's people at any stage of a company are pretty important, and and within a small company, it's all about that rocking the boat. You don't want somebody to sort of rock the boat. One of the other things which we haven't particularly touched upon, it's not particularly a legal thing per se, but is we've seen quite effective as a commercial practice, is actually coaching. And there are some really, really good companies out there who are used to working with boards that have, or not just boards, teams that have dynamics within them where people don't necessarily understand the impact that their behaviours are having, or why they aren't getting on, or that kind of thing. And actually, right from the outset, I would suggest that something like a really good coach that is able to work with a team is a really good investment. We're seeing a number of investors actually requiring that now. So Ox Sciences have just signed up a substantial arrangement with a company called Horizon 37 just to do exactly that, to work with their portfolio companies, particularly when you've got a dynamic where you might have some academics and you might have, I don't know, sort of somebody who's got, who's come in from industry, like an entrepreneur in residence, that type of thing, then some investor directors as well, throw them into the mix. And so, I think that's sort of, it's not a legal thing, but in terms of being a cultural thing and a way of trying to avoid problems arising in the first place, I think it's certainly something that I would strongly advocate that people look at.
Yeah, that's a helpful tip, because chances are, if you're at an early stage of the company, you're probably having to do everything from top to bottom in the company, and it's really easy to drop the ball on things, or not even notice that you're supposed to be holding the ball on something. So to actually have an external questioner ask the pertinent things is probably very helpful. So we've had a question from James, and I was attempting to talk and clarify what the question meant at the same time. Do any of the three of you feel
it's
like
a common? I feel like we could write books about it. That there are sort of this is actually quite a sort of a common occurrence, that you'll have a very enthusiastic founding team, and then certainly within 12 to 18 months, maybe one of the not all the time, obviously, but relatively frequently, you will find that you have somebody who isn't perhaps coming up to the mark that you were expecting.
I mean, I think it really depends on what stage your company is, because to a certain extent, once you've had that initial round of investment, there are normally a number of additional obligations. So Nicola might be able to talk a bit more about this, but I've certainly seen a lot more requirements now for a business plan at the point of investment, and essentially as part of that business plan, very much setting out exactly what's expected quarter by quarter, or by individual leaders within a business. So that, to a certain extent, provides that degree of certainty. And in terms of it being onerous, it might be onerous, but at the end of the day, it's a condition of the investment that's received. So essentially, it's a matter of, okay, take that and move with it. In terms of an earlier stage company, yes, it is difficult to set out what those overarching aims are. Again, I think it's probably, if at all possible, really splitting out between founders what areas of focus that they are focusing on, where there's the collaboration, and where possible, setting quarter by quarter aims or objectives. By doing that, you can then, first of all, be able to demonstrate to future investors that we've gone from this position to this position, and we've built our business, and this is where we succeeded, as a positive. And then in the event something goes wrong, you're able to then demonstrate, well, actually, we talked about this, we agreed collectively that this is what you were going to do, and this hasn't happened, and you've got a marker for it. The main difficulty I see is founders almost overlapping. and saying, wait a minute, well, I was going to do that, but you did it and you got there slightly quicker, but otherwise I would have done it. And if you haven't got that clear sort of separation or focus between founders, that's where things can start to go wrong, particularly in terms of that structure.
Sure. And I think the other thing with founders, you know, sort of in particular, you know, from the outset, you know, at the point at which, you know, yes, there will be an allocation of shares that you kind of agree between you. Those are your founding shares that sort of represent almost kind of what you've done to date. And in terms of future incentives, you know, and future contribution, actually a way of being able to deal with that is through option arrangements. So it's like, this has been our contribution to date. We all agree that, you know, we wouldn't have got to this point without this input from A, this input from B, and this input from C. And therefore, we are going to just draw a line in the sand today at the point at which the company is incorporated or spun out. That means that the equity is split like this. Going forward, however, relates to future performance and it's forward looking. And therefore, if you want to be rewarded with regard, if you say that you're going to be really involved with the company and you're going to do X, Y, and Z, that's fantastic. We're going to reward you with options, but those options are actually only going to vest and be exercisable in the event that you do what you say you're going to do. So if you say that you're going to create some development plan, if you're going to say that you're going to lead a team to reach a particular commercial milestone or whatever it might be, fantastic, we'll reward you once it's done. So options are a really useful mechanism and tool for achieving that in terms of the sort of reward side of things. There is also contractual obligations between the company and those individuals with regard to what they're going to do going forward. And it could be an employment contract, you know, with roles and that type of thing, you know, sort of set out and responsibility set out in it. It could be a consulting agreement. And so certainly academics, by way of example, who are employed by Oxford are able to provide consulting services to companies. But for the first 12 months, that has to go via OUI. So the contracting party is actually OUI and the company, with the sort of academic providing consulting in the background. And if you think that, you know, that's, you know, I'm picking on academics, but it, you know, in the event that it was an academic co-founder that was causing a bit of a headache, then you've got the sort of the guardian, if you like, of OUI there, where you can go, well, hang on a minute, this person wants to be paid a consultancy fee. What have they actually done for the consulting fee? You know, they've said they're going to commit X days a month or X days a year. Thinking about something in the shower is not them committing to X days a year, which, and believe me, we have genuinely heard, oh, well, I was thinking about you whilst I was in the lab. You know, I was thinking about you when I was writing an article. It's like, well, kind of like, and actually, and we've had that from some very eminent professors as well, who just kind of sort of think the fact that they're on your cap table is enough to justify them being paid a sort of consulting fee. And then when you bring in, you know, sort of your auditors who then go, well, hang on a minute, what is it where are the invoices and what exactly have they done for this time that you're paying? Actually, you've got a governance issue there, or a governance challenge, which again, sort of perhaps, you know, draws to the attention of these people that actually they are expected to do something rather than just thinking about you whilst they were in their labs and deigning you with their presence, you know, every other board meeting or something. That I would sort of say, certainly in relation to sort of earlier stage stuff, is something that should be considered.
I think the message that is clear all the way through these sessions with regard to building a team is the way that you deal with the team cannot be something that you do in your spare time. It is actually, you need to be thinking about it in advance, you need to be on top of it, you need to be managing the processes, and it doesn't just come out in the wash, which I think is an approach that is quite commonly observed in early stage companies. So being on top of your employment elements is actually key. And if you are not skilled in this, then you should be seeking support and assistance from those people who are, rather than attempting to add this as yet another slightly tenuous string to your existing bow.
Can I just say something? And apologies for being late. Number one, I'd love to get the recording of this. And secondly, as very early stage founder, the one thing that we really learned from was salespeople. And I think it's a really undervalued resource in terms of building a team. It's as if sales is like this dirty word or something. And actually, I've learned the most from working with. So my co-founder has a sales and marketing background. And I would never have thought that that would have been as helpful as it is in really understanding the realities of a lot of these things. So I suppose that's my comment for James.
And there is always a way forward, you know. I mean, yes, sort of the tax implications are different as between, sort of options versus, an allotment of equity. But again, you can have vesting agreements which kind of look like option agreements with regards to, you will get these shares in anticipation of you doing the following, and in the event that you don't do the following, then those shares will convert to deferred shares. So there are all sorts of ways of being able to sort of deal with those things. It just requires a bit of a brainstorm and a bit of sometimes some creative thinking.
Excellent. Okay. I think we may be all out of questions. In which case I suggest that we end early, and hopefully we can get the recordings of the series sorted out. One final thing was that we do have a scheduled workshop for a couple of weeks' time. However, it now inconveniently clashes with budget day, which obviously you can imagine that Sharon and Sue find that budget day is quite a busy point in their schedule. So we felt that it would be better to rearrange that, and then we could have their great wisdom among us rather than avoiding hanging out with them. So we will send you a proposed new date in due course. So
Sure.
That session that is booked in, I can't get to my diary without causing absolute.
It's in 2 weeks' time. It's on the set, so it was booked in for the 17th of November, which is now budget day. And I also think we've got still quite a lot of ongoing uncertainty around train strikes. So certainly I know that I've got events next week that are now being moved to the week after because of the train strikes. Thinking aloud and actually not talking to anybody about this other than thinking aloud. We've got the next series of dates so the next cluster of events is around sort of commercial optimization and sort of contracts and that type of thing. But I'm actually wondering whether we try and squeeze in the workshop actually just before we kick off that next cluster, which then means it's the new year.
Yes. Yeah.
And hopefully people's diaries will be clearer than they are between now and Christmas, and hopefully we won't get another budget landed on us, or new Prime Minister, or new Chancellor, or I don't know, another pandemic, or whatever it might be.
Well, the only thing that's remained constant is the Archbishop of Canterbury. So,
As I revealed to my team earlier, bearing in mind what our KYC processes and AML processes are like, and when you have a politically exposed person, that's like another level of stuff. And I have revealed, big reveal, that I know what Matt Hancock is doing with his I'm a Celeb money, because he's actually investing it into a technology company that we advise. So our client service team are going to have lots of fun, to the extent we actually got to the point of having a debate about whether he needed to sign a power of attorney before he went into the jungle. So on that note,
I think my head just exploded. It's good to know you can even wear me down. Okay, well, thank you very much, Alex. The alternative variation on the theme of Jeff and Sharon for their wonderful help today, and hopefully we can get the videos out shortly, and then people can catch up with the bits. So, oh look, we're getting smiling faces from everyone. How lovely. Hello, smiling faces.
Thank you very much.
Cool. No problem at all. And we'll see you all soon, and watch out for the workshop.
Yeah, not the 17th. We can cancel that in
we will cancel the 17th. Maybe we could get Matt Hancock to come along and talk about being a business angel.